The studio lights beamed down like judgment. It was supposed to be just another late-night segment, Stephen Colbert behind the desk, papers in hand, smug smile loaded, ready to take his usual jabs. But this time, the script wasn't satire. It was personal. He looked up, leaned forward, and with a sneer that barely hid his glee, muttered into the microphone. He got what he deserved. The audience paused. Some chuckled uncomfortably. Others clapped, not fully understanding what he meant. But Karoline Leavitt, sitting silently in the guest chair just off camera, heard it loud and clear. He was talking about Charlie Kirk. Her friend. Her ally. Her brother-in-arms in a movement built on conviction, not applause lines. And Colbert had just danced on his grave in front of millions. Karoline didn't blink. She sat there, stiff as stone, her right hand tightening into a fist on her lap. The cameras hadn't even cut to her yet, but her presence was building like a storm. One of the producers whispered into Colbert's earpiece, "We're live in 5 seconds with Karoline." He smirked. Even better. The transition was seamless. The audience clapped again as the camera cut to Karoline. She wore navy. No flashy colors, no frills, just a sharp suit and a small silver cross that hung from her neck. The contrast was deliberate. Colbert leaned back in his chair. "Karoline Leavitt, welcome back. Shame about Charlie, but let's be honest, he played with fire." That was it. Karoline didn't wait for the next question. She didn't offer a rehearsed line or political platitude. She leaned forward, planted both palms on the desk, and looked Colbert dead in the eye. Her voice was steady, but her tone was ice. "Say his name again. I dare you." The audience froze. The band went silent. Colbert blinked. Karoline wasn't there to laugh. She was there for war. Because this wasn't about views, ratings, or spin. This was about honor. And she wasn't going to let anyone mock the dead, especially not someone like him. Colbert's usual smirk faltered, just for a second. But Karoline caught it. The man who made his living off mockery and punchlines had just realized he wasn't sitting across from a lightweight. She wasn't a guest. She was a reckoning. "Charlie Kirk," Colbert finally said, dragging out the syllables with exaggerated flair, "was a provocateur. He played politics like a demolition derby. And sometimes, Karoline, people like that crash." There was that laugh again, low, smug, calculated to ignite. But Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Her fingers trembled, not with weakness, but from the pressure of holding back a tidal wave. She placed the letter on the desk between them. "What's this?" Colbert asked, glancing down. "His final words," Karoline said, her voice sharp as cut glass. "The message Charlie wrote the night before he died. Unpublished. Private. Until now." Colbert's hand hovered, hesitant. "You're playing drama," he said, trying to reclaim control of the room. "No," Karoline snapped. "You played disrespect. I'm giving him the voice you just spit on." The studio felt different now. The laughter was gone. Even the crew behind the cameras, so used to jokes, chaos, and last-minute edits, stood still. All eyes were on that single page. Colbert tried to laugh again, but it rang hollow. "So what, we're doing story time now?" Karoline didn't wait. She opened the letter slowly and began to read, not in a performance voice, but in a reverent, anchored cadence. "If this world silences me, let it be known, I never once bent for approval. I lived for the truth, not the applause. And if my words outlive me, let them echo in the halls they tried to shut down." She stopped. Just for a second. Her jaw clenched. Then she looked back at Colbert and said, louder this time, "You didn't just insult a man. You spat on his sacrifice. And you expect me to smile through it?" Colbert leaned back. His hands no longer in control of the desk. The reins had shifted. Karoline wasn't just confronting a host. She was confronting a culture, a media machine that mocked what it didn't understand. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because the silence now spoke volumes. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was accountability. Colbert leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk like a predator ready to pounce. But Karoline had already flipped the board. "You're emotional," he muttered with that tired showbiz grin. "Maybe we should cut to commercial, give you a moment." Karoline's glare didn't blink. "Is that how you handle everything real? Cut to black when it gets inconvenient?" He chuckled again, but this time it felt nervous, fragile even. "This is a comedy show, Karoline. Not a funeral." She stood up. Not in protest. In purpose. The audience gasped, not from shock, but because something electric rippled through the room. Karoline didn't pace. She didn't even gesture. She just looked Colbert dead in the eye and said, "You laugh. I bury my friend." Colbert opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. "You sat in that chair," she continued, voice trembling but rising with every word, "and you mocked a man who gave his life to this country's voice. A man who fought with words because cowards like you fight with sneers." A producer off-camera frantically waved, trying to cut the feed, redirect the segment. But the camera stayed locked. Karoline turned toward the audience now, toward the nation watching live. "You don't have to agree with him," she said, "but mocking his death to score likes? That's not wit, that's rot." Her words cracked like thunder. "You ever served your country, Stephen?" she asked suddenly. Colbert blinked. "No." "Ever stood at a gravesite for a man who got threats just for speaking?" "No." "Then don't talk about what someone deserves." Silence. Dead silence. Colbert finally said, "You really want to turn this into a political moment?" Karoline stepped closer to the desk. "You already did." And for the first time that night, Colbert didn't have a punchline. Just a face, red with frustration, and eyes darting for an escape that wasn't there. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just stared, because the air had shifted. Karoline wasn't just winning the moment. She was owning the room. Karoline didn't sit back down. She remained standing, her frame casting a shadow across Colbert's desk, and her presence beginning to dwarf the studio's bright veneer. The cameras were still rolling, millions watching, and Colbert, usually king of the moment, sat speechless, lips tight, fingers curled around his cue cards like they might protect him. Then Karoline reached into her blazer. The audience shifted. Even Colbert flinched. She pulled out a letter, folded, worn, creased at the edges. She held it up, slowly, like it was heavier than paper. And it was. Because it was the last thing Charlie Kirk ever wrote to her. "This isn't for a headline," she said, her voice firm. "This was never meant to be read on air. But since you opened the grave, let's tell the truth." Colbert tried to interrupt. "I don't think." Karoline snapped, "No. You don't." Then she turned to the camera. "He wrote this after getting another round of death threats. And you know what his concern was? Me. Whether I'd be safe traveling to an event. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He prayed for me." Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the page. She looked down, then back at the lens. "Karoline, they want us quiet. But we don't raise our voices to be loud, we do it so others know they're not alone. If I fall, don't stop. If they laugh, speak louder. If they lie, read the truth out loud." The words hung there, raw and electric. Karoline folded the letter again, gently, with reverence. Then she looked back at Colbert. "You mocked a man who bled conviction. Who didn't need a desk, a teleprompter, or applause to speak truth." Colbert, visibly uncomfortable now, leaned back. "It's a late-night show, Karoline. People come here to laugh." She nodded. "Then why are they crying?" A tear slipped down one woman's cheek in the front row. No one clapped. No one cheered. The gravity was too heavy. Karoline returned to her seat slowly, placing the letter on the table between them. It sat there like a moral indictment. Colbert didn't touch it. He couldn't. Because in that moment, everyone watching understood. The letter had more weight than his entire monologue. Colbert stared at the letter on the desk like it might ignite. For once, the man who made a career out of mocking others had nothing clever to say. No quip. No punchline. The audience sat in stiff silence, leaning in, not for a laugh, but for the next blow. And Karoline wasn't finished. You stood there, she said, turning to him again, in front of millions, and said, he got what he deserved. You think that's edgy? It's cowardly. Colbert blinked hard. It was a joke. Satire. Stop hiding behind that word, Karoline cut in, sharp and exact. Satire requires intelligence. What you did was smear a man who can no longer speak for himself. And you did it from behind a desk, knowing he couldn't clap back. The control room hesitated. Do they cut to commercial? Do they kill the feed? But producers, sensing the firestorm building online, let it roll. Because every second Karoline stayed on camera, the internet lit up. Twitter, on fire. YouTube, stream clips climbing by the second. Karoline versus Colbert trended above world news. Karoline leaned forward. You've had sitting senators on this show. Presidents. But the man who scared you most was a 30-something conservative who used words like bullets and faith like armor. Colbert adjusted his blazer, trying to regain rhythm. I poke fun at everyone, Karoline. Right, left. No, you pick your targets carefully, she said, her tone ice. You never sneer at the ones who fund your sponsors. You never joke about your own. Only those who challenge your echo chamber. She stood again. The audience wasn't clapping. They were watching like witnesses to something irreversible. Charlie Kirk didn't need your approval, she continued. He didn't beg for studio lights or applause. He died with his boots on, speaking truth. Her voice cracked, just slightly, an edge of grief breaking through the fury. Then, almost whispering. Your entire set is built to make truth sound ridiculous. But today, truth walked in. Colbert tried to chuckle, forced. Bit dramatic, don't you think? Karoline stared at him for a long moment. And then said quietly, not as dramatic as calling a dead man a punchline. Boom. The studio didn't erupt. It deflated. Every joke, every light, every smirk, it all collapsed into itself. Colbert sat still. The only thing louder than Karoline's voice was the shame hanging in the air. The cameras were still rolling, but the energy in the room had changed. The temperature dropped, not literally, but in tone, in atmosphere. Something raw had broken loose, something Colbert and his crew couldn't stuff back into the comedy box. And Karoline stood right at the center of it. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't soften her posture. Do you even know what Charlie died doing? She asked. Her voice, though calm, had a hard edge now, like steel under silk. Colbert shrugged, uncomfortable. I saw something on Twitter. A rally, I guess? No, Karoline said. He wasn't giving a speech. He wasn't trying to win a vote. He was holding the hand of a grieving father in East Palestine. A man whose daughter died from chemical exposure while your friends in D.C. looked away. Colbert's smirk slipped. That's tragic, of course, but... No. Don't do that, she snapped. Don't fake empathy now. Not after you laughed. The audience shifted in their seats. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was confrontation with no commercial break, no cue cards, no safe punchline waiting to rescue the host. Karoline stepped toward him again. You say Charlie was just a talking head. But the man you called disposable spent more time in forgotten American towns than your whole staff combined. He fed families. He raised money for wounded veterans. He was in the dirt, not behind a desk. A producer signaled nervously off camera. Another whispered into Colbert's earpiece. Move on, they were urging. Shift it. Lighten it up. But Colbert knew. There was no going back now. People like you, Karoline continued, think you're the gatekeepers of truth because you wear suits and get applause from a crowd that's been told when to laugh. But truth isn't a performance. It's sacrifice. It's standing in the fire when everyone else is running. She looked around the studio, eyes sweeping across the crowd. Charlie stood in that fire. Then she turned to the camera. And if you're sitting at home, wondering whether this country still values the ones who actually show up, ask yourself something. Would you rather be remembered for jokes, or for showing up when it counted? Silence. Even the studio lights seemed dimmer. Colbert's voice finally returned, but softer now. You know, I didn't know him like you did. No, Karoline said flatly, you didn't want to. She picked up the crumpled letter from the table, the one she had thrown earlier, and unfolded it. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. From restraint. Then she read a line aloud. If I die doing this, at least I'll die telling the truth. Charlie Kirk. The audience gasped. Karoline looked Colbert dead in the eye. That line aged better than your jokes ever will. A low murmur rippled through the audience, that stunned silence that follows something too real to ignore. There were no stage cues now, no blinking red applause sign. People just sat there. Some leaned forward. A few looked at each other, unsure what they were witnessing anymore. A comedy show? A confrontation? Or the unraveling of something much bigger? Karoline folded Charlie's letter again with reverence, like it was a flag. Colbert adjusted in his chair. His charm, usually his armor, had melted away. Look, Karoline, I never meant to. To what? She cut in. To spit on the grave of a man whose death you mocked for views? Colbert blinked. For the first time in years, he looked like a man unsure of his words. Karoline didn't stop. You're the kind of guy who sneers from skyscraper studios while America bleeds in silence. You think it's edgy to punch down on the people who actually build this country. Someone in the audience clapped once, then stopped, realizing no one joined in. Karoline's voice dropped, now quieter, but more dangerous. Charlie Kirk made you nervous. Not because he was loud. Not because he was conservative. But because he was effective. He moved people. He filled stadiums. He built a platform without your networks, without your gatekeepers, without your Hollywood donors. And you couldn't stand it. Colbert tried to interject, but his voice cracked, too weak. And now that he's gone, Karoline continued, you feel bold. You think it's safe to joke. But let me tell you something, Stephen. She stood, not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just with the quiet confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing left to prove. You can sit behind that desk for the next 10 years. You can keep reading punchlines written by people who never leave Brooklyn. But the American people are waking up. And one day, you'll look out at this studio and see something worse than outrage. She leaned forward. You'll see empty seats. Gasps. No cue needed. She stepped away from the desk, no longer waiting for permission, and turned back to the camera. This isn't about Charlie anymore. This is about what's left behind when good men are gone, and whether we let smirking cowards rewrite their legacy in cheap one-liners. A pause. I won't let that happen. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. And for once, neither did the crowd. As Karoline exited the stage, the silence didn't follow her, it stayed behind and hovered like a fog over the late-night set. The usual energy, the chuckles and soft laughter, the orchestrated swell of applause, all of it was dead. Stephen Colbert sat frozen, gripping the edge of his desk like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. He looked toward his producers through the glass. No one moved. No hand signals. No countdown. Just blank faces, some even with downturned eyes, unsure whether they were watching a segment fall apart or history being made. Karoline's footsteps echoed as she walked off stage. The audience heard every step. No one reached for a phone. No one clapped. One older woman in the third row reached for a tissue. Backstage, Karoline didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She handed Charlie's letter, now slightly bent at the corners, to her assistant and whispered, "Scan it. We're publishing it tonight. Every word." The assistant nodded and rushed off. Karoline sat, upright, heels still on, eyes still on fire. Back on set, Colbert tried to rally. "Well, folks, lively discussion, huh?" "Nothing." He forced a chuckle. "She certainly doesn't hold back." Still nothing. Then, a voice from the back, no mic, just raw, cut through the fog. She was right. Everyone turned. It was the sound tech. The same guy who'd been patching mic levels for years. He didn't shout. He didn't grandstand. He just said it. She was right. Charlie stood for something. And you laughed when he died. Colbert's mouth twitched. His hands fidgeted with the cue cards. Another voice, this time from a young man in the audience. "What happened to you, Stephen?" Then another, "You used to be funny. Now you're just bitter." And then came the final blow, from an old woman in the front row wearing a flag pin. She didn't stand. She didn't yell. She just looked at him and said, clear as a bell. "Charlie had courage. You have a desk." It spread like wildfire. Clips started uploading to X, Rumble, YouTube. Not edited clips, not manipulated reels. Raw footage. Straight from the camera feed. 10 angles. One truth. Hashtag Charlie was right started trending in minutes. But another hashtag climbed faster. Hashtag you have a desk. No spin. No narrative. Just a nation watching a man who had mocked a death, and been buried under the weight of one woman's truth. And Karoline? She was already back in the car, pulling out her phone. She typed 5 words. "Letter drops at midnight. K." And hit send. Midnight struck, and with it, Karoline's post went live. No flashy edits. No dramatic soundtrack. Just a high-resolution scan of Charlie Kirk's handwritten letter. The real one. No filters. No AI-generated overlays. Just pen, paper, and the unmistakable conviction of a man who had spent his final days fighting for the nation he loved. The post caption read, "This wasn't just a friend's goodbye. This was a warning." And Stephen Colbert laughed at it. The internet erupted. Within 10 minutes, the letter had over 1 million impressions on X. Hashtag Colbert is over trended worldwide. Even celebrities who once hesitated to weigh in now shared the post in silence, just the letter, no commentary. The words spoke louder than any tag or caption ever could. The first paragraph hit like a hammer. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. But you're still here, and that means you have to fight harder. Not just for policy. Not just for power. But for the soul of the nation that raised us." The second paragraph cut deeper. "The media doesn't care. They'll laugh at your loss, mock your prayers, and call your truth misinformation. But you keep speaking. Because truth has no expiration date, and cowards have no legacy." By the third paragraph, the world stood still. If my death becomes a joke to them, let it be the last joke they ever make without consequence. That line alone was reposted by senators, athletes, Gold Star families, and veterans. It was printed on signs in cities from Dallas to Detroit. A mural began forming overnight in Phoenix. The words were no longer Charlie's. They belonged to a movement. Karoline's follow-up video, shot in her car, with no makeup, no lighting crew, no teleprompter, went live at 12:30 a.m. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She just stared into the camera with the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights and said, "You mocked a dead man on national television. You didn't mock me. You mocked millions of Americans who feel unseen, unheard, and disposable. So let me be perfectly clear. You will be seen. She paused. This letter will be read in every high school that still believes in freedom. In every church that still preaches truth. And one day, it'll be in the Library of Congress. You can archive your jokes. We're archiving history. The views skyrocketed. Even platforms that tried to throttle conservative voices couldn't contain it. It was too big, too raw, too real. Meanwhile, Colbert's team went into panic mode. Crisis PR firms were called. Segments were pulled. Apologies were drafted, then deleted. Damage control was impossible. You can't unring a bell when the whole country's already wide awake. The Late Show's next taping? Cancelled. The audience? Refunded. The reputation? On fire. And Karoline? She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply prepared for the one moment that was still left to come, the final confrontation. The network was hesitant. They knew Karoline's request wasn't a publicity stunt, it was a reckoning. She didn't want airtime to sell a book or push a policy. She wanted something far more dangerous, accountability, in real time. So they agreed. On one condition. She would appear live, no pre-records, no edits, no redos, just her, a camera, and Colbert sitting across from her for the first time since his infamous remark. The set was cold when she entered. Colbert didn't crack a joke. His usual swagger had melted into an uncomfortable stiffness. Producers whispered behind the glass. The countdown began. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. Colbert tried to open with a joke, "I see the cavalry's arrived," but Karoline didn't even blink. She leaned forward, slid a folder across the desk, and said, "Read it." Out loud. Colbert glanced down. It was a transcript of Charlie's final speech, the one he delivered a week before his death. The one Colbert had never aired, never acknowledged, and allegedly never watched. He chuckled nervously. "I don't think that's." "You said he got what he deserved," Karoline cut in, her voice razor-sharp. "Now let the American people hear what he actually said before they decide what he deserved." The audience was frozen. No laughter. No applause. Just breathless silence. Colbert hesitated, then opened the folder. "Freedom," he began reading, "is not a gift from government. It's a responsibility passed through generations. If we fail to defend it, we don't lose a party. We lose a civilization." His voice faltered. "They will mock you for standing alone. But better to be mocked standing for something than praised bowing to nothing." Colbert stopped. His eyes didn't lift. Karoline leaned in, almost whispering. "You turned a patriot's death into a punchline. And now? You've got nothing but dead air." She rose slowly, looked directly into the camera, and delivered her final words. "Stephen Colbert wants you to believe this movement is dying. But the only thing dying is his influence." She walked off set. No mic drop. No spin. Just truth, and a trail of millions who followed. The clip went viral within minutes. Not just across conservative networks, but everywhere. Even traditional media couldn't ignore it. Headlines lit up. Colbert brought to silence by Charlie Kirk's final words. Karoline Leavitt ends the Late Show's smirk era. Truth just outrated comedy. And as for Colbert? Ratings dropped 47% over the next 2 weeks. Sponsors pulled back. Calls flooded the network from viewers who once laughed with him, now demanding to know why they ever did. Karoline never returned to the studio. She didn't need to. She had already carved her message across the country's conscience, not with bitterness, but with resolve. Because sometimes, the loudest voices fall silent. And sometimes, the quietest truth shatters the whole room. They mocked a man who stood for freedom, and Karoline made the whole world listen. When Colbert snickered, he thought it was just another line. But she turned his smirk into silence, and his stage into a courtroom. This wasn't just a debate, it was justice. If you stand with truth, with Karoline, share this. Spread it. Make them hear it. Because next time they laugh, they'll remember what came after.